Where Zombaku locks your opponent out of any kind of play, Kujikiricongo does exactly the same thing, but he also is telling you that it's your own goddamn fault.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey card fighters, welcome back to another deck profile on the channel, and today we're gonna cover none other than Kujikiricongo, the second deck archetype in the first wave of Nubatama, and in my personal opinion, the more interesting one to play than Magatsu Storm, as this deck is all about playing around your opponent and making sure that all their decisions are a bad decision. Either they're gonna be punished for filling the board, or they're gonna be punished for calling nothing to the board. And that makes this deck, in my opinion, very fun to play. And it can have some really weird situation where you OTK your opponent in a scenario where you think, I should not be able to OTK them at this point. But you guys know the drill, the timetables are around here. And without further ado, let's jump right into this list as soon as we have enough to talk about this deck profile and with all the crazy interactions that you can do with this deck. For this Nubatama deck list, we run a total of 9 grade 3s, 12 grade 2s, 12 grade 1s, and 17 grade 0s. That deck list is as following. We run 4 copies of Shura Stealth Dragon Kujikiricongo, and he is the main boss monster of the deck. This is also the reason why we called the deck after him, and he allows us to synergize with every other skill that we use in this deck. Whenever we bounce something back, he generates a guard restriction, and also in the case that we want to, we can force our opponent to ditch a card from their hand without even attacking or doing something. For the supporting grade 3s, we run 3 copies of Stealth Beast Kokushiqarasu, and this is the card that allows us to make some insanely power plays and allows us to minus our opponent by a whopping -8 or even numbers like -12 or 13. But I will go into that in more detail later down the video. And lastly, for the supporting grade 3s, we run 2 copies of Stealth Dragon Voidmaster. And just like in our previous deck list for Nubatama, it allows us to bounce any kind of card back to the hand from us or our opponent, and in this case probably from our opponent, as it then synergizes even better with Kujikiricongo. For the grade 2s, we run 4 copies of Shura Stealth Dragon Kabukicongo, and this is our main grade 2 that allows us to bounce back an entire column, but also force our opponent to ditch some cards. And at the same time, it gains some power, so it's a nice beat stick. So it's overall a pretty damn good card. For the other grade 2s, we run 4 copies of Stealth Dragon Magatsu Gale. We basically run this card to bounce some specific cards back to our hand, but in some good scenarios, it can also be a nice 15k beater that allows us to draw some extra cards if we're missing some key pieces. And lastly, we run 4 copies of Momentary Stealth Rogue Tsunamasa, and Tsunamasa has the same role in this deck as it did in the Magatsu Gale deck, that it can power up some units, mainly probably our Vanguard, and at the same time generate some resources, and it can bounce itself back so we can use its skill multiple times during one single game. For the grade 1s, we run 4 copies of Stealth Dragon Dreadmaster, and this is the main grade 1 support card for Kujikiricongo that allows us to force our opponents to bounce something back, and he also needs to discard something, and at the same time it's a nice booster that can gain some nice power. We also run 4 copies of Stealth Rogue of the Night Sakurafubuki, and once again this is a night card that can generate some extra counterblast, as since this deck will use a lot of counterblast, and we can bounce it back with something like Voidmaster, but in most cases we are not really gonna do that, as since that's a net 0 on counterblast gain. And lastly, we run 4 copies of Tempest Stealth Rogue Fuuki, and this is just a card that allows us to hit higher numbers. It's a nice beat stick on its own, but it can also be an enormous booster, and paired it off with the guard restriction that we can build up with Kujikiricongo, that can be really nasty in some scenarios. For the grade 0 lineup, we of course run our generic starter, that's Stealth Dragon Magatsu Wind. Sadly, we don't have something else, so it's a little bit weird that we run a Magatsu starter in this deck. And for the triggers, we run 4 heals, 8 crit, 4 draw RPGs, so nothing really special to that end. So making a total of 9 grade 3s, 12 grade 2s, 12 grade 1s, and 17 grade 0s. The main objective of this deck is to bounce back as many rear guards as possible, so your Kujikiricongo guard restrict skill restricts all possible guard options. All the while you're forcing your opponent to minus as much as possible. The main skills to do this are Kujikiricongo's counterblast skill, Kabukicongo and Dreadmasters, and Kokushiqarasu skill. By combining these cards, you can make your opponent go -9 for the cost of 3 Counterblast and 4 Soul Blast, and 2 Sentinels, all the while generating guard restrict for the grades you just bounced. You can do this if they have 3 rear guards on the field where 2 are in one column. You start your turn by placing Kabukicongo and bounce back a column, and they discard 2 cards. Now, while they still have more than 3 cards in their hand, you can use Kujikiricongo's skill to make them discard another card. Now, with 1 rear guard left, you can activate Kokushiqarasu skill to bounce that unit back and make them discard 5 cards. Now, if you want, you can place a Dreadmaster to the field and use his skill, and although you can't bounce anything back, they are still forced to discard a card, making them go -9 this turn. 3 from the field and 6 from the hand. And all the while, the following 3 attacks they probably can guard with grid 1s and 2s. If they have a full field and you have 5 counterblasts, 7 souls and 2 sentinels, you can perform the ultimate hand destruction no jutsu. You call Kabukicongo to the left, use its skill, you then call one to the right and use his skill, now activate Kujikiricongo's discard skill, followed up by using Kokushiqarasu, and lastly, by calling whopping 4 Dreadmasters, your opponent just went -14. 5 from the field and 9 from the hand. And they probably can't guard the next attack with grade 1s and 2s. If they're lucky. Note, this is even more devastating against Neonectar, because they have grade 0 plant tokens. So if you bounce one of those, they can't guard with triggers as well. But what's even better, because you bounce tokens to the hand, and as soon as they can't exist there, they will be therefore removed from the hand, so they -1 extra card for every plant token you bounce. Because that happens immediately, so they can choose to discard them. So if they were bounced back with Kabukicongo, that counterblast 2 skill made them -3 instead of the usual -2. Resource management is going to be tough. You're going to be juggling with your units a lot to have access to as many skills as possible. A lot of your units cost counterblast, but to be fair, Voidmaster is more of a last resort unit in case you're stuck. Then you can bounce something back from either you or your opponent to keep the ball rolling. The following 3 units will be used a lot, but luckily we have a countercharger that works with a on-place effect, so Magatsu Gale and Voidmaster can bounce it back if needed. A good thing to keep in mind, although Kujikiricongo's skill actively minus your opponent's hand, it's usually more valuable to use your counterblast to bounce back and then discard cards, because you also generate guard restriction, making it even harder for your opponents to survive that turn. Soul is a lot easier to manage, as seen as 2 of your soul blasting units also can regain that soul back. Although you use Tsunamasa mostly to generate more soul, but in some cases it's useful to bounce it back. We are using soul mainly for Dreadmaster and Kokushiqarasu, as seen as we're probably going to use Kokushiqarasu only once in a game. It's safe to say that soul is something that probably won't be an issue. The main strategy of the deck is, as stated before, is all about bouncing units back to get the guard restrict, but also to manage your opponent's hand as much as possible. Use Kabukicongo's skill before Dreadmaster, as seen as Dreadmaster gives your opponent to choose and therefore can deny you a full column bounce with Kabukicongo. Also in that note, don't waste that card on only 1 rearguard, it's not worth the 2 counterblast. Magatsu Gale is a perfect card to bounce back units to activate their on-place effect again, like Sakurafubuki or Dreadmaster, but it can also clear the front row to deny them free attacks into your rearguards. If you need more soul to set up your Kokushiqarasu play next turn, you can use a Gale to bounce back Tsunamasa, and next turn you can call him back to the field, and this way you generated 2 soul from 1 Tsunamasa. The key point of this deck is timing. Try to use your bounce back card in moderation, don't just burst everything early on, as you won't be doing much when you run out of steam. Force them to high damage without using a lot of bouncing skills. The best thing to do is bounce back a grid 1 and 2 each turn to force them to waste triggers or take damage. Then when they are on 4 or 5 damage, then you start using all your skills to minus them hard, and that's also the right time to use Kokushiqarasu. If your opponent isn't calling units to the field, then that's an ideal moment to use your Kujikiricongo's discard skill. You want to hurt their hand each and every turn. This can be by forcefully let them to discard a lot of cards, or in the form of awkward guard restrictions that forces them to discard excess amount of shield. There's a lot of other cards that I can think of in terms of alternative options. You might want to change the grade 3 lineup, maybe more Voidmasters and less Kokushiqarasu. For grade 2s, you can look into the 15k beater if you don't like either Gale or Tsunamasa. And for the grade 1s, maybe you want to run 1 or 2 Oboro cards to make higher numbers. This is a new deck type in Vanguard, at least in Standard, and that is the discard deck. This deck can force your opponents in an awkward position. Either you punish them for not calling cards, and it's seen as your protect land that makes them killing you really hard, or you punish them for calling units by generating a nasty guard restriction. However you slice it, this deck can have a nasty bite if piloted right, because this deck requires precise resource management and timing of skills to make any kind of matchup end in your victory. And that concludes this deck profile for Nubatama, and this is also the last Nubatama deck profile we're going to cover for now, as seen as there isn't really that much more to go over for the deck. And as I said before, it's one of those, it's the more interesting that appeals to me more, as the playstyle is a more interesting and more dynamic, and it just can have some crazy interactions between all these different cards that you suddenly can make your opponent go -10 when everything just falls out right, and those numbers in Standard is just mind-blowing to think about. But let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of this deck profile and how the way Nubatama got support in general, and how you're gonna build these decks, as seen as there are a lot of other ways that you can do it. And I'm very excited for the support, and I'm curious of what you guys think about it. But as always guys, if you're interested in more videos surrounding deck profiles for the upcoming sets or other related Vanguard content, then hitting the bell button and subscribe button to be updated. But as always guys, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.